When you picture a family surviving a brutal winter on the frontier, you think about firewood, cutting it, stacking it, burning enough to keep the cabin warm through the night. You imagine the fight as a contest between fire and cold. Feed the stove fast enough, and the cold loses. But the cold did not kill most families by overpowering their fire. It killed them by finding every crack in the wall, every gap in the door frame, every square inch of uninsulated plank, and pulling the heat out faster than any stove could replace it. The families who froze were not the ones who ran out of wood. They were the ones whose houses could not hold what the wood gave them. One man understood this. He had learned it as a boy, with his hand pressed flat against a wall. And when he lost everything else, that knowledge was the only thing he had left. 2 days after Christmas, 1886, Malin Rusk packed his family's life into a mule sled by lantern light. The bank had taken the cabin that morning. Not the land. Lathrop wanted the land to look abandoned so he could petition for it clean. But the cabin, the stove bolted to the hearthstones, the hay in the lean-to, and every stick of cordwood stacked against the north wall. $31 in coin sat in Malin's coat pocket. 4 children sat in the dark behind him. His wife, Elspeth, had been in the ground since April, killed by lung fever before the last snow melted. The nearest charity room in Watertown was full. Rail fare east for 5 people cost more than he had earned since harvest failed, and the temperature had not climbed above 0 in 6 days. Cora, 14, wrapped bread in a flour sack without being told. She moved the way her mother had moved. Quiet hands, fast work, no wasted motion. Bram, 11, tried to lift the cracked box stove's lid to check the coals and burned his thumb on the rim. He did not cry. He put his thumb in his mouth and kept working. Ludi, 7, held her younger brother's coat closed because the top button was missing. Asa, 4, asked whether their mother knew where they were going. Malin did not answer. He cinched the rope around the stove and dragged it toward the sled. The stove was the one thing Lathrop had not listed on the bank inventory. An oversight, or perhaps a contempt so complete that a cracked box stove was not worth the ink. It weighed more than Asa and Ludi combined. The mule coughed when Malin loaded it. The runners groaned on frozen mud. They left the cabin with the door standing open. Frost would claim the inside walls before morning. The farm had not failed because Malin was lazy or stupid. It had failed because grasshoppers had stripped the wheat in 1885, and drought had baked the replanted field into dust, and Malin had borrowed against the next harvest to buy seed and flour and shoes for children whose feet would not stop growing. The note was held by the Watertown Farmers and Drovers Bank. The bank's manager, Roscoe Lathrop, had extended credit in the spring with the warmth of a man selling kindling to a freezing family. By autumn, when the harvest came up short again, Lathrop's warmth vanished. He accelerated the note 2 weeks before Christmas. The sheriff's deputy, a young man named Parnell Ames, had delivered the papers while Malin's children sat at the kitchen table with their mittens still on. Ames had not been able to meet the children's eyes. He had asked Malin to sign, and Malin had signed. And Ames had left with his boots tracking black mud across the floor Elspeth had swept every morning for 9 years. The red wax of the foreclosure seal cracked in the cold before Ames reached his horse. Malin had been a lot of things before he was a failed wheat farmer. He had cut ice on the Kennebec River in Maine as a boy, working beside his father, Orison, in ice houses where the walls were packed 3 feet deep with sawdust, and the summer air never touched the winter's harvest. He had loaded freight in Boston. He had laid rail ties in Pennsylvania. He had come west in 1879 because the Homestead Act promised 160 acres to anyone willing to prove up a claim, and Elspeth had wanted land for the children, and Malin had wanted to stop working for men who owned things he would never own. Now he owned nothing. The land was not yet legally gone. Abandonment required time and a petition. But the cabin, the stove, the hay, and the wood were bank property. Malin had a mule with a cough, 2 quilts, a cracked stove the bank had overlooked, 4 children, and $31. 6 days until the next predicted hard front. Ephraim Calkins found them the next morning. Calkins was 61 years old, a former stage station keeper who had survived 2 decades of Dakota winters by knowing exactly what cold required and never pretending otherwise. He served now as the township road overseer, which meant he spent his winters checking fence lines, bridge timbers, and the occasional family that had gone too quiet. He had seen Mullen's cabin standing open and followed the sled tracks to a shallow cut bank along the lake road where Mullen had made a windbreak from the sled and a canvas sheet. The children were inside, pressed together like puppies. Asa's lips were blue. The stove sat on bare frozen ground with no chimney pipe. Mullen had not had time to rig one on, and a small fire of twisted grass and broken slats burned in the open firebox, the heat scattering into the wind almost as fast as it rose. Calkins did not waste words on sympathy. He crouched beside the stove, looked at the children, looked at the mule, and looked at Mullen. "You need 6 cords of dry wood to get through to March," Calkins said. "Minimum, you need a tight roof, a working chimney, walls that do not have daylight showing through them, and a south-facing door." Mullen said nothing. "You have less than 1 cord on that sled. You have no shelter. You have 4 children, one of whom is coughing and a mule that sounds worse." Calkins pulled off his glove and held his hand near the stove. The heat vanished before it reached his fingers. "A man can be proud in July, Rusk. In January, pride is how children freeze." "I am not proud," Mullen said. "I am thinking." "Think faster." Calkins laid out the arithmetic the way a man reads a eulogy, plain, certain, and final. Dry cordwood was selling for $8 to $10 a cord because every family on the prairie was burning through their reserves. At $9 a cord, 6 cords cost $54. Mullen had 31. If he bought 3 cords and nothing else, no flour, no salt, no medicine for Asa's cough, he could feed a stove for maybe 6 weeks. But he had no walls to hold the heat. An open fire on the prairie in January was a way to watch money turn into smoke. Freighted coal from Watertown cost more than cordwood and required a stove that did not have a crack running from the firebox to the ash door. The charity rooms were full of families whose farms had failed the same way Mullen's had: grasshoppers, drought, credit, foreclosure, and then winter. The churches had given what they could. The territory had no relief fund. Calkins stood up. "Come to town. Sleep in the livery. It is not warm, but it has walls." Mullen looked at his children. Cora had not stopped watching Calkins since he arrived. Her eyes were her mother's, careful, measuring, waiting to see whether the world would offer something worth trusting. "How long can we stay in the livery?" Mullen asked. "A night, maybe 2. Halstead will not keep you past that. He has horses that need the space." "And then?" Calkins did not answer. He did not need to. The answer was nowhere. There was no place in Watertown, Dakota Territory, for a widower with 4 children, $31, and no legal shelter. The town had enough trouble sheltering its own. Mullen loaded the children onto the sled. Asa coughed so hard the sled rope shook in Mullen's hand. The mule leaned into the harness and pulled, and they moved east along the lake road toward town, the runners cutting fresh tracks in snow that squealed like wire under pressure. But Mullen was not looking at the road. He was looking at the lake. The old Campeska Ice Company building sat half buried at the edge of the frozen lake, its loading door chained shut, its lower vents drifted over with snow. The company had failed 2 years earlier after a rail siding dispute cut off its shipping route and a warm winter spoiled part of its stock. Boys had thrown stones through the outer cladding on the south side. A section of the roof overhang had collapsed under snow weight. The building looked like what it was, a dead commercial structure that no one had bothered to tear down because the lumber was not worth the labor of pulling the nails. Mullen stopped the mule. The building was roughly 40 feet by 60 feet, timber-framed, with a tall loading bay on the east end where ice blocks had been slid in on ramps during the winter harvest. It had double plank walls, an inner wall and an outer wall with a cavity between them packed with sawdust. The north and west walls, which faced the worst weather and had been expanded after ice losses in 1883, had cavities nearly 3 feet deep. The south and east walls were closer to 12 to 18 inches. The floor was sloped plank, draining toward a trench that ran the length of the building and emptied through a frozen culvert toward the lake. Malin knew this building. Not this specific building, but its kind. He knew it the way a man knows his father's trade even after he has left it behind. He had spent his boyhood inside ice houses on the Kennebec River. He had watched his father, Orison Rusk, line walls with dry sawdust, check drainage grades, seal vents against summer air, and explain to anyone who would listen that an ice house was not a freezer. It was a barrier. It was built to stop heat from crossing a wall. Every design choice, the double walls, the sawdust fill, the drainage, the lack of windows, the sealed doors, existed for one purpose: to keep the inside condition from changing. The memory hit him like a hand on his chest. His father, holding a lantern close to a wall of stacked ice, the yellow light catching sawdust dust in the air, the smell of pine, the creak of frozen rope, Orison pressing young Malin's palm against two boards, one bare, one backed with packed sawdust, and making him hold both until he could feel the difference. The bare board stole heat from his hand. The sawdust-backed board did not. It felt like nothing. It felt like dead air. "Do not fear cold as much as moving air," Orison had said. "Cold sits. Wind kills." If the building could stop summer heat from entering and melting stored ice, it could slow winter heat from escaping a living space. The physics were the same. The direction was reversed. Insulation did not care which way the temperature gradient ran. It only cared whether it was dry. Malin looked at the building. He looked at his children on the sled. He looked at the padlock on the loading door chain. He picked up the wagon wrench from under the stove and broke the lock with 2 blows. The chain fell into the snow with a dull sound. The door swung inward on frozen hinges, releasing a breath of stale air that smelled like old pine, mouse nests, and dry sawdust. He was not a fool. He knew this was unlawful. He knew the ice company's assets were tangled in liens. He knew Lathrop would hear about the broken lock before sunset. But his youngest child was shivering hard enough that the sled rope trembled, and the livery would hold them for one night, and after that, there was nothing but open prairie and the kind of cold that killed quietly. Malin stepped inside. The cavernous space was dark, except for the gray light that leaked through the broken cladding. Ice racks stood empty along the walls. The floor was gritty with old sawdust and frozen mouse droppings. The air was still. That was the thing that stopped him. The air was perfectly, completely still. No wind, no draft, no movement at all. Outside, the wind had been scraping across the frozen lake hard enough to push snow sideways. Inside, a cobweb hung motionless from a crossbeam. He walked to the northwest corner. The walls here were the thickest, nearly 3 feet of packed sawdust between the inner and outer planks. He pressed his palm against the inner wall. It was cold, but it was not the biting cold of open air. It was the flat, neutral cold of mass that had not been heated, dead cold, the kind that would respond to warmth and hold it. "Cora," he called, "bring the stove." Martha Tilden arrived the next afternoon with a loaf of bread wrapped in a dishcloth and the expression of a woman who had heard something she did not believe and needed to see it for herself. She was 36, the storekeeper's sister, practical in the way that prairie women were practical ours. She did not waste anger or pity on things that could not be fixed, but she had sharp opinions about things that could. She found Malin inside the ice house, on his knees, using a salvaged board to scrape frozen mouse droppings off the floor of the northwest corner. The children were sitting on their bedrolls near the cracked stove, which Malin had set up on a flat stone with a makeshift chimney pipe running through a hole he had punched in the outer wall. The pipe leaked smoke at every joint. Asa was coughing. Ludi was sorting bent nails into a tin. Bram was trying to cut canvas with a dull knife. Martha set the bread on a barrel and looked around the ice house the way a woman looks at a room where the furniture is wrong. "You're putting children where men stored ice," she said. Malin did not argue. He stood up, took Martha's hand without asking permission, and held it near the inner wall of the northwest corner. Then he walked her to the broken loading door on the east side, where wind pushed through the gaps in the cladding, and held her hand there. "Feel the difference," he said. The wall was still. The door breathed cold. "The danger is not the old ice," Malin said. "There is no old ice. It melted and drained 2 summers ago. The danger is the air. Moving air steals heat faster than cold temperature does. These walls were built to stop air. 3 feet of dry sawdust between 2 layers of plank. No windows. No gaps. If I seal that door, build a partition in the thick-walled corner, and put the stove inside, the room will hold heat the way a jar holds water." Martha pulled her hand back. "And if the sawdust catches fire? Then I have built a coffin instead of a house. That is the risk." "That is a large risk to take with 4 children. The alternative is no walls at all. Which risk would you choose?" Martha did not answer right away. She looked at Asa, who was leaning against Cora's shoulder with his eyes half closed, his breath making small clouds that vanished before they rose. She looked at the stove, which was radiating a circle of warmth that reached maybe 4 feet in every direction before the cavernous space swallowed it. "What do you need?" she asked. "Planks, canvas, straw, oakum if anyone has it, nails, brick or flat stones for the stove base, and every scrap of dry sawdust in this building moved away from the stovepipe." Martha said she would see what she could find. She did not promise. She did not refuse. She picked up her dishcloth and left the bread. Malin's plan was specific. He would partition off a 16 by 20-foot room in the northwest corner, the thickest walled section, using salvaged planks, empty ice racks, canvas, and straw mats. The stove would sit on a base of brick and flat stone, with the chimney pipe running through a protected thimble in the outer wall. He would seal the loading door with snow blocks and boards. He would keep one vent pipe clear for air exchange. He would raise the beds on wooden skids, 18 inches off the floor, because cold air pooled low and the plank floor was a drain, not an insulator. He would build a second inner door so that every entrance became a cold trap. Open one door, close it, then open the second. No straight path for wind to follow, and he would keep the sawdust dry. That was the rule that governed everything. Wet sawdust lost its insulating value. It compressed, froze into a solid mass, and conducted cold instead of blocking it. Worse, damp sawdust rotted and generated heat of its own, not enough to warm a room, but enough to create moisture that spread the rot further. If the sawdust stayed dry, the walls would work. If it got wet, the building was just a wooden box with no more protection than a claim shanty. The risk calculation was brutal. If the sawdust was wet, the insulation failed and they froze. If the stovepipe leaked, smoke poisoned them. If snow blocked the vent, they suffocated. If Lathrop reported the break-in before the walls could prove themselves, the law would drag them out. 4 ways to die and 1 narrow path through. Malin chose the path. He told Cora to find something to write with. From this moment forward, she would record every temperature, every armload of wood burned, and every hour the stove was lit. If the ice house worked, the numbers would prove it. If it did not, the numbers would explain why. The town heard before sunset. The gossip moved the way gossip always moved in small prairie settlements, carried by men who stopped at Tilden's store for tobacco, repeated by women drawing water at the pump, whispered by children who dared each other to go near the lake road after dark. The line that stuck was simple and cruel. Rusk moved his babies into a freezer and called it a house. The mockery was not malicious in the way Lathrop's foreclosure was malicious. It was the mockery of people who could see only what they knew. An ice house was where you stored ice. It was windowless, lightless, and built for cold. Putting children inside one was either madness or grief so deep it had eaten through a man's judgment. Women whispered that Elspeth's death had loosened something in Mahlon's mind. Men shook their heads and said it would not last a week. Someone left a dead crow on the threshold, which was either a prank or a warning, and no one admitted to it. Roscoe Lathrop heard the news and saw an opportunity collapsing. Lathrop was not a simple villain. He was a bank manager in a territory where half the farms were failing, and the bank's reserves depended on recovering assets from notes that would never be repaid. If Mahlon disappeared quietly, moved east, gave up the claim, let the land revert, the foreclosure was clean. No public sympathy, no awkward questions at depositor meetings. But if Malin survived publicly in a structure visible from the lake road, the story changed. The bank had thrown a widower and 4 children into winter. Every person who passed the ice house and saw smoke rising from a chimney pipe would do the arithmetic and come up with the same answer. Lathrop chose the note over the children. Lathrop arrived at the ice house on the 3rd day with Deputy Ames at his side. Ames looked like a man being forced to attend his own hanging. Lathrop looked like a man delivering one. "The ice company's assets are tangled in liens," Lathrop said. He stood in the loading bay with his coat buttoned to his chin, his breath fogging, his eyes moving across the interior the way a man inventories property he expects to own. "The bank may have a claim on this structure. You broke the lock. That is destruction of secured property." Malin was kneeling beside the stove, feeding it a piece of broken crate. He did not stand up. "The lock was rusted through," Malin said. "It broke when I touched it." "You touched it with a wagon wrench. Deputy Ames found the pieces." Ames said nothing. He stood near the loading door with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the floor. Lathrop stepped closer. "You lost one roof by arithmetic, Rusk. Do not lose your children by imagination." Malin stood up slowly. He was taller than Lathrop by half a head and thinner by 30 pounds, and he had the look of a man who had stopped being afraid of authority because authority had already done its worst. "My children are warmer in here than they were in your charity rooms," Malin said, "which were full." Lathrop turned to Ames. "Note the broken lock. Note the occupancy. Note the children." Ames pulled a small notebook from his coat. He wrote something. His pencil did not move much. "I will be back," Lathrop said, "with paperwork." He left the ice house and walked back toward town. Ames lingered. He looked at the children, at the stove, at the makeshift chimney pipe leaking smoke into the rafters. He looked at Malin. "Fix that pipe," Ames said quietly. "If it kills one of them, the paperwork will not matter." Then he followed Lathrop into the cold. Malin could not wait for permission that would never come. He could not wait for the town to approve what the town had already mocked. He could not wait for Lathrop's paperwork or Calkin's arithmetic or Martha Tilden's cautious, maybe. The temperature was falling. Asa's cough was getting worse. The stove ate wood the way a river eats snow, constantly, invisibly, and without satisfaction. He started building the partition the morning after Lathrop's visit. The work was brutal because it was work meant for 3 men done by 1 man, a 14-year-old girl, and an 11-year-old boy. Malin pulled planks from the collapsed roof overhang, prying frozen nails with the claw of a borrowed hammer. Every board had to be checked for rot, measured against the partition line he had chalked on the floor, and fitted into place with whatever fasteners he could find. Bent nails straightened by Ludi on a flat stone, wooden pegs cut from ice rack crossbars, strips of rawhide soaked and wrapped around joints. Cora worked beside him without complaint and without rest. She held boards while he nailed. She carried sawdust from the dry upper loft in a grain scoop, 1 trip at a time, up and down a ladder that creaked under her weight. She packed the sawdust between the partition planks the way her father had taught her, not loose, not crushed, but firm and even like filling a jar with dry sand. Bram hauled stones from the lake shore for the stove base. The stones were frozen to the ground and had to be pried loose with a bar. His hands blistered through his gloves. His shoulders ached. He did not complain because Cora did not complain, and he would not be the one who broke first. Ludi sorted nails by straightness and size. She sat on an upturned bucket with a tin between her knees and a seriousness that made her look older than 7. She rejected any nail bent more than halfway and set the good ones in rows. When she ran out of nails to sort, she twisted straw into plugs for cracks. Asa carried kindling. Each piece was no longer than his forearm. He walked back and forth between the salvage pile and the stove with the focus of a child who had been given one job and would not fail at it. His cough rattled in his chest. Malin listened for it the way a man listens for a crack in a river ice, constantly, without appearing to. Day 1. The partition line was chalked, one wall framed with planks and ice rack timber. The northwest corner began to take shape as a room within a room. The outer walls were the ice house's original double plank construction with sawdust fill. The partition wall was Mullen's addition, single plank on the room side, canvas stretched over ice racks on the open side, with dry sawdust packed between. It was not 3 feet thick, it was maybe 8 inches. But 8 inches of dry sawdust between two barriers was better than the single-wall claim shanties half the county was shivering in. Day 2. The inner door was hung. It was crooked. The frame was made from 4 different boards of 4 different thicknesses. But it closed, and when it closed, the air in the partition room went still. Mullen stood inside with the door shut and the stove unlit. He held his hand up. No draft. He could feel his own breath settling around him, undisturbed. That stillness was worth more than firewood. The stovepipe was the problem. Mullen had punched a rough hole through the outer wall to run the pipe, but the pipe was too short, the joints leaked, and the draft pulled wrong when the wind shifted. On the second night, a backdraft filled the room with smoke so thick that Cora grabbed Asa and Ludi and pushed them through both doors into the outer chamber, while Mullen and Bram beat the stove damper open with a piece of firewood. Bram's eyes streamed. Mullen's lungs burned. The smoke cleared slowly, pulled out through the gaps in the cladding that Mullen had not yet sealed. They slept that night with the inner door cracked open, the stove burning low, and the temperature in the room hovering somewhere around freezing. It was not warm, but it was not the open prairie, and the wind did not reach them, and Asa slept for 4 straight hours without coughing. Outside, the temperature dropped to 14 below. Inside the partition room, the water bucket skinned over with ice, but did not freeze solid. Mullen stared at that bucket the way another man might stare at a vein of gold, thin ice on still water. The room was holding, not well, not safely, not enough, but holding. The mule went lame on the 3rd day, a stone bruise on the left forefoot that made the animal refuse to pull. Mullen's supply runs to town, already slow, became impossible without borrowing a horse he could not afford. He sent Bram on foot to Tilden's store for a pound of flour and a bundle of oakum, and Bram came back 2 hours later with the flour, no oakum, and the news that Lathrop had posted a notice on the ice house door claiming unlawful occupation of liened property. Mullen read the notice by lantern light. It gave him 7 days to vacate. 7 days. The partition was half built. The stovepipe still leaked. The sawdust in the west wall smelled faintly sour, the first sign of moisture. The inner door did not seal at the bottom, and Asa's cough had moved deeper into his chest, a wet sound that made Mullen's hands go cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. If you have ever been told that what you were building was foolish by someone who only saw the risk and not the work you had already done, tell us in the comments. Because Mullen Rusk had 7 days, a half-built wall, a leaking stovepipe, 4 children, and an eviction notice nailed to the door of a building the whole town called a freezer, and the temperature had not finished falling. 7 days. The sawdust in the west wall was going damp. The stovepipe fought him every time the wind shifted. Lathrop's notice hung on the door like a clock counting backward. And somewhere out on the open prairie, the next cold front was building. A wall of air so dense and so cold that cattle would freeze standing in their own tracks. Mullen needed help he had not asked for and did not expect. He needed someone who understood what this building was, not what it looked like, but what it could do. He needed someone who had built for cold before and knew the difference between a wall that held and a wall that breathed. He did not know it yet, but that person was already watching. Oddmund Brecka appeared on the 4th day, not because anyone sent him and not because he was kind. He appeared because he was walking the lake road to check a fence post he had set in October, and he saw Mullen on the roof of the ice house trying to reseat a warped vent board with a hammer that was too light for the job. Oddmund was 64 years old, Norwegian-born, a carpenter by trade, and a former ice yard foreman by necessity. He had helped modify this same building in 1883 after melt losses ruined half a summer's stock. He had thickened the north and west wall cavities from 18 inches to nearly 3 feet, repacked the sawdust, regraded the drainage trench, and sealed the loading bay with a system of overlapping boards that could be opened for ice delivery and closed tight against summer air. He knew every joint, every timber, every place where moisture crept and rot started. He stood on the lake road and watched Malin work. Malin was doing it wrong. The vent board needed to be shaved on the bottom edge, not forced, but he was doing it wrong in the right direction. He was reading the building. He was not patching blindly. He was looking at how the board had warped and trying to correct the cause, not just the symptom. Oddmund climbed the drift against the north wall and pulled himself onto the roof. Malin looked at him the way a dog looks at a stranger near its food. Not aggressive, but not welcoming. "You are fighting the grain," Oddmund said. His accent was thick, but his English was precise, the kind learned from men who did not tolerate misunderstanding on a job site. The board swelled from the wet side. "Shave the belly. It will sit." "I do not have a draw knife," Malin said. Oddmund pulled a folding knife from his coat, opened it, and handed it to Malin handle first. "Shave thin. 3 passes." Malin shaved the board. 3 passes. The board seated flat. The vent closed for the first time since the building had been abandoned. Oddmund looked at the chimney pipes sticking through the outer wall below them. He looked at the tracks in the snow, children's footprints, mule prints, sled runners, the marks of boards dragged through drifts. He looked at the broken padlock hanging from the chain on the loading door. "You are living inside," Oddmund said. It was not a question. "Yes." "The northwest corner?" "Yes." "How thick are the walls there?" "Nearly 3 feet on the north and west, closer to a foot on the partition I built." Oddmund was quiet for a long time. Wind pushed across the lake and hit the building without moving anything inside the vent they had just sealed. That silence said more than a thermometer. "You have good fear," Oddmund said. Malin did not understand. Good fear measures before it runs. Bad fear runs first. Oddmund pointed at the chimney pipe. "That pipe is too close to the inner wall. The sawdust behind that wall has not been checked since 1884. If it is damp, you have a slow fire waiting. If it is dry and the pipe heats the plank, you have a fast one." "I know." "Then why is the pipe still there?" "Because my son cannot breathe without the stove." Oddmund looked at Malin. Something shifted in his face, not softness, but recognition. The look of a man who sees a problem he knows how to solve in the hands of a man who is almost solving it alone. "I will come tomorrow," Oddmund said. "I will bring a draw knife and a thimble collar. Move the pipe tonight, 6 inches from the wall, minimum. Wire it. Do not nail it. Nails conduct heat." He climbed down from the roof and walked back toward town. He did not offer sympathy. He did not ask about the children. He did not mention Lathrop or the eviction notice. He had seen the building, he had seen the man, and he had made a decision that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with craft. Oddmund returned the next morning with a draw knife, a tin thimble collar for the stovepipe, a coil of iron wire, and a sack of dry pine shavings. He did not knock. He walked through the loading door, through the outer chamber, and into the partition room where Malin was feeding the stove with the last of the broken crate wood. The first thing Oddmund did was cut an inspection plug from the inner wall. He used the draw knife to score a square of plank 6 inches across, then popped it free with the knife tip. Behind the plank was sawdust, packed, dry, and the color of old rust. "Smell it," Oddmund said. Malin leaned close. The sawdust smelled sharp and faintly sweet. Pine resin, dry wood dust. "That is good," Oddmund said. "Dry sawdust smells like the tree it came from. Wet sawdust smells sour, like vinegar and rot. If you smell sour, the wall is dying." He moved to the west wall and cut a second plug. The sawdust behind it was darker. He pressed it between his fingers. It crumbled but left a faint stain on his skin. "This is starting," Oddmund said. "Not wet yet. Damp. Moisture is coming from somewhere. Maybe the ground. Maybe blown snow through the cladding gaps. Maybe condensation from the stove." He marked the damp section with a piece of charcoal, drawing a line 2 feet long on the inner wall. "Watch this. If the line grows, the wall is failing. They cut 4 more inspection plugs along the perimeter. 3 were dry. One, near the floor on the south side, where the cladding was broken, was wet enough that Odmund could squeeze water from the sawdust. "That section is dead," Odmund said. "The sawdust is frozen now, but when the stove warms the room, it will thaw, and the rot will move." He looked at Malin. "You must dig it out and repack it dry, or accept that the south wall will lose half its value by February." Malin looked at the south wall. It was the thinnest wall, 12 to 14 inches of cavity. Repacking it meant pulling the inner planks, scooping out wet sawdust, finding dry replacement, and resealing, in a building where every board was being used for something. "Tomorrow," Malin said. "Today," Odmund said. "Rot does not wait." They pulled the inner planks on the wet section that afternoon. Cora hauled dry sawdust down from the upper loft in the grain scoop. Bram carried the wet sawdust outside in a bucket, dumping it far from the building so the moisture would not seep back. Odmund showed Malin how to feel the studs for dampness, how to check the outer cladding for gaps where wind drove snow into the cavity, and how to seal those gaps with a paste of tallow and sawdust pressed into the cracks. The second lesson came that evening when the wind shifted and the stovepipe began to smoke again. "Your problem is the entry," Odmund said. He pointed at the loading door, which Malin had partially blocked with snow and boards but not sealed. "Wind comes through the big door, crosses the outer chamber, finds the gap under your partition door, and pushes the stovepipe draft backward. The stove cannot draw because the air is already moving the wrong direction." "I plan to seal the door." "Sealing is not enough. You need a crooked path." Odmund picked up 2 short boards and held them at right angles to each other. "2 doors. The first opens into the outer chamber. The second opens into the partition room. They are not in line. Wind enters the first door, hits the wall, must turn, finds the second door, and by the time it has turned, it has lost its force. This is how ice houses were loaded in summer. Never a straight path from outside to inside. Every turn kills the wind." They built the airlock that night. Malin hung the first door, a salvaged panel from the collapsed overhang, across the main entry gap they had been using. 6 feet farther along the outer chamber wall, at a right angle, they hung the second door into the partition room. The path between them required 2 turns. By the time Malin closed both doors and lit the stove, the smoke rose straight and clean for the first time since they had moved in. Cora recorded the result in her ledger. Outside, 19 below. Outer chamber 2 above 0. Partition room with stove lit. 41 degrees within the first hour. The numbers were not warm, but they were different from outside in a way that could be measured and trusted. The third lesson was about fire. Odmund showed Malin how to mount the thimble collar, a tin sleeve set into the wall where the stovepipe passed through, with a 2-inch gap between the pipe and the wood, packed with sand and clay, not sawdust. He showed him how to wire the pipe joints instead of forcing them tight, so that expansion from heat would not crack the joints and spray sparks. He showed him how to test the draft with a feather held near the stove door and a lit match held near the vent. If the feather pulled inward and the match flame bent outward, the airflow was correct. If either one reversed, the system was choking. "Fire needs a deliberate mouth," Odmund said. "You decide where it breathes in. You decide where it breathes out. If the fire decides for itself, you have lost the building." That night, with both doors closed, the vent drawing, and the stovepipe properly mounted, the partition room reached 52 degrees. Malin sat on the edge of Asa's raised bed and listened to his son breathe. The cough was still there, but Asa was sleeping through it. His lips were not blue. His hands, for the first time in days, were not clenched. The construction became a rhythm. Dawn. Check inspection plugs. Check vent. Check stovepipe. Morning. Haul sawdust. Seal cracks. Improve the partition. Afternoon. Scavenge materials. Haul wood. Fix whatever had broken overnight. Evening. Record temperatures. Feed the stove. Listen to the walls. Day 5. The outer loading door was fully sealed with snow blocks, boards, and a layer of frozen straw. Calkins arrived with a borrowed thermometer and the expression of a man expecting to confirm his own worst predictions. He refused to enter through the airlock. He stood outside and demanded that Mullen bring the children out. Mullen refused. "Come inside and see." Calkins came inside. He walked through the first door, turned the corner, walked through the second door, and stopped. The partition room was 46 degrees. The stove was burning low, a handful of split wood, barely enough to heat a kettle. Calkins could see the children, Cora writing in the ledger, Bram mending a boot, Ludi asleep on the raised bed, Asa sitting beside her with a cup of warm water. Calkins checked the walls. He put his hand on the north wall. He put his hand on the partition wall. He looked at the stovepipe and the thimble collar and the wire joints. "The pipe crosses near the sawdust in the upper corner," Calkins said. His voice was flat and hard. "You have built a tinderbox." Oddman stepped forward. "The thimble has a 2-inch sand gap. I packed it myself." "Sand shifts. Heat warps tin. A single spark in that cavity and the whole building goes in 5 minutes." Calkins pointed at the junction where the pipe entered the thimble. "That joint is not tight enough." Oddman looked at the joint. He looked at Calkins, and then he nodded. "He is right," Oddman said to Mullen. Mullen stared at him. "You built that joint yesterday. And today I can see it is not good enough. The collar needs to be reset with a wider gap and a clay pack instead of sand. Sand can shift and leave a bare spot. Clay holds." Oddman looked at Calkins. "Can you bring clay?" Calkins said nothing for a long time. He was not accustomed to being asked for help by men he had warned against the very thing they were doing. But the question was specific, it was practical, and it was about keeping children alive. He said he would bring clay from the riverbank if it was not frozen too deep to dig. The thimble was rebuilt the next day. Calkins brought the clay in a bucket, watched Oddman and Mullen repack it, and left without saying whether he approved or disapproved. He took the temperature reading on his way out, 22 below outside, 49 degrees in the partition room. He wrote both numbers in his own notebook. Day 6. Martha Tilden sent 2 boys with a sled carrying 6 broken storm windows. Not for windows. The ice house did not need windows and could not afford the heat loss, but for glass panes that Mullen could set into a small observation hatch between the living bay and the outer chamber. The hatch let him check the outer space without opening the airlock door. Through it, he could see frost forming on the outer walls, snow drifting against the sealed loading door, and critically whether the vent pipe on the far side of the chamber was still clear. Day 7. The outside temperature fell to 20 below. Mullen fed the stove at dusk, checked the inspection plugs, checked the vent, checked the thimble. He lay down on the raised bed beside Asa. The room was 48 degrees. The stove crackled low. The air was still. He could hear Bram breathing. He could hear Ludi shifting in her sleep. He could hear the building itself, the faint tick of wood contracting in the cold, the deep groan of the outer timbers settling against frozen ground. He did not sleep. He listened for the building to fail. It did not fail. But the building had not been truly tested. 20 below was cold. It was not the worst cold. The worst cold, when it came, would not arrive gradually. It would come as a wall. On the 8th morning, Mullen and Cora ran the first real measurement. Outside, 18 below zero. The outer chamber, 6 degrees above zero. The partition room, before the stove was lit, with 4 adults and 4 children breathing inside, because Oddman had slept near the entry the night before, and Norrie Tilden, Martha's nephew, had come to deliver oats and stayed through the dark, 39 degrees. Mullen lit the stove, one small cookfire, the kind Elspeth used to make for porridge. After an hour, with 6 people in the room, the temperature reached 58 degrees. Cora wrote it in the ledger. She underlined it. Mullen told her not to underline. One measurement proved nothing. One warm morning in a cold week was an anecdote. He needed a pattern, but Oddman saw something Mullen did not. He was watching Asa. The boy was standing near the stove with his mittens off, his hands open, drying them. His mittens were drying. For the first time since the eviction, something wet was becoming dry inside a room the boy lived in. The ice house was not just holding temperature, it was holding conditions. The ability to dry cloth, warm skin, and recover from cold. Oddman frowned at the northeast corner. The temperature there was lower than the rest of the room, maybe 10 degrees colder. He ran his hand along the wall and found a seam where two boards had separated. Not much, a quarter inch. But a quarter inch of gap in a wall meant a quarter inch of moving air, and moving air in January was the difference between a room and a sieve. They packed the seam with twisted straw and tallow paste. The corner warmed within the hour, but the skeptics were not inside the partition room. They were in town, and they had not stopped talking. Calkins told anyone who asked that the ice house was a fire trap. He was not wrong to worry, and his worry made the mockery worse because it gave the doubters a credible voice. If a man who had survived 20 Dakota winters said the building was dangerous, the building was dangerous. The fact that it was also warm did not enter the argument because no one except Mullen's family and Oddman had felt the warmth. Martha Tilden worried about smoke. She had lost a cousin to a chimney fire in Minnesota and could not separate the idea of a stove inside a sawdust building from the image of a family burning alive. She brought food but would not stay inside the partition room for more than a few minutes. Lathrop said the temperature figures were invented. He had not entered the building. He had no intention of entering the building. His position was simpler than the truth. The building was illegal occupancy, the figures were a desperate man's lies, and the sheriff would act as soon as the paperwork cleared. He sent a letter to the county sheriff asking for a formal removal order. The letter was dated January 3, 1887. The sky that week went the color of green-gray iron. Telegraph talk from stations west of town reported a severe cold wave building over the northern plains. Cattlemen who had watched the sky for 30 years said it would be the worst of the winter. Cattle bunched against fence lines, pressing together until the wire sang. The lake ice boomed at night, deep, percussive cracks that sounded like cannon shot and meant the ice was thickening so fast it was splitting under its own pressure. The children sensed it before the adults named it. Asa stopped asking to go outside. Ludi moved her bedroll closer to the stove. Bram stacked every piece of wood he could find inside the airlock entry, where it would stay dry and close. Cora sharpened her pencil and divided her ledger page into columns. Hour, outside temperature, chamber temperature, room temperature, wood burned, vent status, wind direction. Oddman came to Mullen the night before the storm and spoke quietly so the children would not hear. "The building will not save you if you behave like fools," Oddman said. "No open flame near loose sawdust, no blocked vents, no wet boots against the inner wall, no opening both doors at once. If the vent clogs with snow, you must clear it or you will suffocate before you freeze. And do not overfire the stove because you are afraid. Fear wastes wood. The walls are doing the work. Let them." Mullen nodded. He looked at Oddman's hand, which was wrapped in a rag-stained dark. On the 5th day, Oddman had sliced his palm on a rusted strap hinge while pulling boards from the collapsed overhang. The cut was deep, and he had refused to let Martha Tilden look at it because he said he had cut himself worse on ice saws. The rag had not been changed since. "Your hand," Mullen said. "My hand will keep," Oddman said. "Your vent will not. Go check it now." The blizzard arrived on January 9th, 1887, and it arrived as a wall. The wind came over Lake Campeska from the northwest, carrying powdered snow so dense and so fine that the far shore disappeared in minutes. The air turned white. The sky vanished. Sound changed. The wind did not howl the way storms howled in stories. It roared. A low, constant, pressing roar, like standing inside a drum while someone beat it from outside without stopping. The loading door braces groaned. Snow packed against the north side of the building in drifts that rose a foot an hour. The outer thermometer was unreadable by noon because the glass was caked with ice. By evening, when Mullen scraped it clear with a knife, it read 40 below. Inside the partition room, the temperature was 62 degrees. The stove burned steadily. The vent drew. The walls held. Hour 1. The wind increased. The building creaked in ways Malin had not heard before. Not the settling groans of cold timber, but the lateral stress of wind pushing against the north wall. He put his hand on the inner planks. They were still. The sawdust absorbed the vibration, but the outer cladding rattled, and twice a board popped loose somewhere above the roofline, the sound sharp as a gunshot. Hour 2. Asa's fever began. It came fast, the way fevers came in young children, fine one moment, hot to the touch the next, and then the cough changed. It was no longer the dry bark of cold air in small lungs. It was wet, crouping, each breath pulled in with a sound like a saw blade catching. Cora boiled water on the stove and held Asa near the steam. Malin watched the stove temperature. He could not overfire it. The thimble was good. Calkin's clay pack was solid. But the risk was not the thimble. The risk was heat radiating through the wall planks near the pipe and drying the sawdust behind them to the point of ignition. Odmund had warned him. The stove must warm the room, not cook the walls. Hour 3. The vent began to clog. Malin saw it first through the observation hatch. The outer chamber, which should have been slightly above zero, was dropping. The air was getting stale. He could feel it in the partition room, a faint heaviness, the beginning of a headache behind his eyes. The vent pipe on the far side of the outer chamber was crusted with snow blown through the external opening. Odmund tied a rope around his own waist and handed the other end to Malin. He walked through the airlock into the outer chamber. The temperature difference hit him like a plunge into water. The outer chamber was below zero. Frost coated every surface. His breath froze before it left his mouth. He crossed the chamber to the vent pipe, found the crust, and broke it with a board. The pipe gasped. Air moved. He felt it pull past his face. Warm air from the partition room being replaced by cold air from outside, the exchange that kept them alive. He came back through the airlock shaking. His wet scarf had frozen to his beard. His hands were white at the fingertips. Cora handed him a cup of warm water, and he held it without drinking until the feeling returned to his fingers. Every 4 hours, Odmund said. Check it every 4 hours. Hour 6. The outer chamber was below zero. The partition room held above 50. Asa's breathing was worse, but his fever had not climbed. Cora kept the steam going. Ludi pressed against Bram on the bed and did not speak. The stove burned half the wood Calkins had predicted they would need for a single night. Half. The walls were doing what Malin said they would do. They were holding the heat instead of letting the fire fight the wind alone. Hour 8. Someone hammered on the outer door. Martha Tilden's nephew, Nori, was 14 and had been sent from town toward the Tilden farm before the storm's full force arrived. He had misjudged the distance, lost the road, found the lake by the sound of ice cracking, and followed the shore until he saw the ice house. He was half frozen. His coat was stiff with ice. His lips were the color of old pewter. Malin faced the choice. Opening the outer door meant flooding the airlock with wind and snow. Opening both doors meant the partition room would lose 10, 15, maybe 20 degrees in minutes. Not opening meant Nori died against the wall. He opened the outer door. Snow blew horizontally into the entry. He grabbed Nori by the collar and dragged him through the first door, then slammed it shut. The airlock was now full of snow and freezing air. Cora and Bram threw a quilt over the crack at the bottom of the inner door. Odmund stripped the ice from Nori's sleeves and coat, working fast, pulling the frozen fabric away from skin before frostbite could set deeper. He did not bring the boy into the partition room immediately. He waited. He let the airlock stabilize. The snow settled. The wind stopped howling through the gaps. The temperature in the small space between the doors climbed from the impossible cold of outside to the merely brutal cold of the outer chamber. Then he opened the inner door. They pulled Nori inside. The partition room temperature dropped from 62 to 51. Cora closed the door behind them. Hour 10. Nori was conscious, wrapped in a quilt, his feet near warm stones that Cora had heated on the stove. Asa was asleep. Ludi was asleep. Bram sat near the observation hatch, watching the outer chamber for anything wrong. The temperature in the partition room had climbed back to 58. The stove burned low and steady. Outside, the world had ceased to exist. There was only wind. If you are invested in this family's survival, stay with us, because the storm is not finished, and what comes to the door next will decide whether this ice house is shelter or coffin. Hour 12. Frost formed around the observation hatch glass. Malin scraped it and peered through. The outer chamber was rimed with ice. Every timber, every nailhead, every abandoned ice rack wearing a coat of frost so thick it looked like the building had grown fur. But the partition wall was dry. The sawdust behind it was doing what 3 feet of packed pine dust was supposed to do, slowing heat transfer to a crawl, making the cold work for every degree it stole. He checked the inspection plugs. Dry, dry, dry. The damp section on the south wall that they had repacked was holding. Hour 14. Oddmund woke Malin and told him to stop feeding the stove so hard. Malin had been adding wood every time the temperature dipped below 55, and the stove was radiating heat that Oddmund could feel in the wall planks near the pipe. The wall must remain dry, not hot, Oddmund said. You are protecting the sawdust, not the air. The air will recover. The sawdust will not. Malin pulled a stick from the firebox and let the stove settle. The temperature dropped to 52. It held there. 52 degrees in a room where the outside air was 40 below. The stove was burning less than a third of what Calkins said a proper cabin would need. In town, the seized Rusk farmhouse told a different story. Lathrop had used the cabin as temporary lodging during the bank's inventory of Mahlon's property. The cabin had single plank walls, a plank roof with gaps where the battens had shrunk, and the stove that Lathrop had seized as bank property. The good stove, the heavy iron one that drew properly and held coals through the night. Lathrop burned through his stacked cordwood and still could not warm the front room above freezing. Wind came through the roof boards and the wall cracks and the window frames and the door gaps. The good stove fought the wind and lost. The cabin bled heat the way a sieve bleeds water, constantly, from everywhere, and no amount of fire could fill it faster than it drained. Lathrop was frightened first. Then he was angry at the building, at the weather, at the territory, at the cruel joke of seizing a cabin that could not keep its own warmth. Then he was something worse than angry. He was humiliated. Somewhere near the lake, in a windowless building he had threatened to have torn down, 4 children were warmer than he was. Hour 18. A sound came through the storm. Bram heard it first. A faint rhythmic banging, metal on wood, coming from the direction of the lake fence. Not the wind. The wind was steady. This was deliberate. Someone was hitting something with the last of their strength. Malin and Oddmund looked at each other. It could be anyone, Oddmund said. It could be no one. It could be a gate banging. Gates do not bang in rhythm. Malin tied the rope around his waist. Oddmund held the other end. Cora stood at the inner door with her hand on the latch. The argument was short. Going out could kill Malin. The wind was strong enough to knock a man down, and the snow was thick enough to lose direction in 10 steps. Staying meant whoever was banging would die against the fence. Oddmund said they could not risk the whole family for one unknown voice. Malin said the last time someone came to his door on business, it was Deputy Amy's, who had looked ashamed while handing over the papers that took his home. Malin went out. The wind hit him like a moving wall. Snow filled his eyes, his mouth, his collar. He could not breathe facing into it. He turned sideways and pulled himself along the rope, then along the fence line, following the banging. 15 steps. 20. The rope ran out. He tied it to a fence post and kept going, one hand on the wire, the other in front of his face. He found Parnell Ames 30 feet from the ice house. The deputy was on his knees in the snow, his revolver in one hand, banging the butt against a fence post. He had been sent with the removal order, Lathrop's paperwork, finally signed by the county sheriff. And he had lost the road somewhere between town and the lake. His horse was gone. His coat was frozen solid. His face was the color of candle wax. Mullen pulled him up. Ames tried to speak and could not. His jaw was locked. Mullen put the deputy's arm over his shoulder and dragged him back along the fence, found the rope, followed it to the door. They brought Ames into the airlock, not into the warm room, into the cold trap between the doors. Odmund insisted. Warming a deeply frozen man too fast could kill him, the cold blood in his limbs rushing back to his heart. They laid him on boards, stripped his frozen coat, and waited. Cora heated stones on the stove, wrapped them in cloth, and passed them through the inner door for his feet. Odmund kept everyone from crowding the space. The partition room dropped to 46 degrees. Slowly, over the next 2 hours, it climbed. 48, 50, 52. By the time Amy's was warm enough to move inside, the room was back to 54 without a roaring fire. Dawn came. The storm did not break so much as exhale. The wind dropped from a roar to a moan. The snow kept falling but no longer flew sideways. Mullen scraped the outer thermometer. It still read below 0. The outer chamber was still rimed with frost. The partition room was 54 degrees, and Asa's breathing had eased, and Nori was sitting up, and Ames was conscious and staring at the walls with the expression of a man who had just been saved by a building he had been sent to empty. Mullen checked the wood stack. They had burned less than a quarter cord through the entire crisis. A quarter cord. In a night when neighboring cabins were burning through a full cord and still freezing, the walls had done the work. The fire had maintained. The sawdust had held. Cora opened her ledger and wrote the final entry for the night. Outside, 40 below at the worst. Outer chamber below 0. Partition room never below 46. Wood burned, less than 1/4 cord. Persons sheltered, 8. Deaths, 0. She underlined the last number. Mullen did not tell her to stop. Ephraim Calkins arrived the morning after the storm expecting to find bodies or smoke damage. He brought a shovel because he assumed he would need to dig through the snow that had drifted 6 feet against the north wall, and he brought a flask of whiskey because he assumed he would need it for what he found inside. He dug through the drift to the outer door. He opened it. He walked through the airlock, turned the corner, and opened the inner door. The partition room was 57 degrees. The stove burned low. Cora sat at the barrel they used as a table, copying temperature figures from her ledger onto a clean sheet. Bram was mending Asa's boot with a strip of rawhide. Ludi was asleep. Asa was sitting up, breathing without the wet rattle that had terrified Malon 2 nights earlier. Nori Tilden was eating cold porridge from a tin cup. Deputy Amy's was wrapped in quilts on the raised bed nearest the stove, awake, watching Calkins with the expression of a man who had stopped understanding the world he lived in. Calkins set the shovel against the wall. He unscrewed the flask, looked at it, and put it back in his coat. He checked the walls. He pressed his palm against the north wall, then the partition wall, then the west wall. He crouched and checked the floor. Dry. The drain trench beneath it, frozen solid, but not backed up. He walked to the stovepipe and examined the thimble collar, the clay pack, the wire joints. He opened the nearest inspection plug and pressed the sawdust between his fingers. Dry. Sharp smell. Pine. He stood in the middle of the room for a long time. Cora watched him the way she watched everything, carefully, without expectations. "I told you what a house needed," Calkins said. His voice was quiet, not humble, precise. "I did not ask what this building already had." Mullen said nothing. There was nothing to say that the room had not already said. Calkins took the ledger from Cora's hands and read it. He read it the way a man reads a surveyor's report, slowly, checking each number against what he knew. Outside temperatures, chamber temperatures, room temperatures, wood burned, hours. He flipped back through the pages. He found the entry from the worst hour of the storm. 40 below outside, 46 in the room, stove burning low, and he held the page for a long time. "You used less than a quarter cord," Calkins said. "Cora measured it. In a night when I burned a full cord and still could not keep my parlor above freezing." Calkins closed the ledger and handed it back to Cora. He looked at Malin. Your father taught you this? My father taught me that dry, still air is more valuable than fire. This building taught me the rest. Calkins nodded once. He picked up his shovel. At the inner door, he stopped. I will tell people the building held, Calkins said. I will not tell them it is safe. That is your job to prove, and you are not finished proving it. He left through the airlock and closed both doors behind him. Malin heard the shovel scraping snow as Calkins cleared the outer entry. The scraping continued for 10 minutes longer than necessary. Calkins was making the path wider. He was making it easier for other people to come. They came within the week. The first was a woman named Dagny Haugen, who lived in a claim shanty 4 miles east with her husband and 3 children. The shanty had single-plank walls and a sod roof that leaked when the wind shifted. During the blizzard, the family had burned their table, 2 chairs, and the frame of a bed to keep the stove going. They survived, but the youngest child had frostbitten toes, and the husband's hands were so cracked from cold that he could not grip an axe handle. Dagny walked to the ice house because she had heard from Martha Tilden that Rusk's building used less wood and stayed warmer, and she wanted to know how to bank snow against her north wall without wetting the sill boards. Malin showed her. He took her outside and pointed to the north wall of the ice house, where the snow drift pressed against the outer cladding. The drift was insulation. Packed snow against the wall reduced wind exposure and added mass. But the danger was the sill. If snow melted against the bottom of the wall, from ground heat or from the stove's warmth radiating outward, the meltwater would seep into the sawdust cavity and rot the insulation from the ground up. You need a gap, Malin said. He showed her the shallow trench Oddman had dug along the base of the north wall before the storm, a channel 6 inches deep that kept the snowdrift from sitting directly on the sill. Snow above the gap insulates. Snow below the gap destroys. The line is the sill. Everything you do protects the sill. Dagny asked whether planer shavings would work instead of sawdust. Her husband had salvaged bags of shavings from the mill in Watertown before it closed. Malin said shavings worked if they were dry and packed firm. Loose shavings left the air pockets too large. The air inside them moved, and moving air conducted heat. Packed shavings were nearly as good as sawdust, but she had to keep them dry, and she had to keep sparks away from them, and she had to check them every week by smell. The second visitor was a teamster named Peter Stensland, who freighted goods between Watertown and Huron and slept in his barn when the weather was bad. He wanted to know how to build an airlock in a barn corner so his horses would stop losing body heat to drafts that blew through the main doors. Malin drew the design in the dirt floor of the outer chamber, 2 doors at right angles, a crooked path, no straight line from outside to inside. The teamster copied it on the back of a feed receipt. The third visitor was Martha Tilden herself. She did not come to ask about insulation. She came to ask Cora for a copy of the temperature ledger. People will not believe a man who lives in a building they call a freezer, Martha said. They will believe numbers. Put the numbers where people can see them. Cora copied the ledger onto 2 large sheets. Martha pinned them to the wall of Tilden's store, between the tobacco shelf and the post office window. For 3 weeks, every person who bought flour, nails, or stamps stood in front of Cora's figures and did the arithmetic. Outside, 40 below. Inside, never below 46. Wood burned a quarter cord. The numbers were harder to mock than the man. Oddman and Malin built the demonstration boxes that same week. 2 wooden boxes, each a foot square. One was bare plank on all sides. The other had a 3-inch cavity packed with dry sawdust between an inner and outer wall. They heated a stone on the stove, placed 1 stone in each box, sealed the lids, and set them on a barrel outside the store. After an hour, Martha opened both boxes in front of 6 people. The bare box stone was cold to the touch. The sawdust box stone was still warm enough to hold comfortably. No one said anything. They did not need to. The stones said it. The measurable comparison traveled farther than Malin expected. Neighboring cabins, the single-wall claim shanties that held most of the county's homesteaders, burned through a cord of wood every 10 to 14 days during severe cold. Some families burned faster. The Rusk partition room, with its 3-foot sawdust walls and airlock entry, used a fraction of that. The numbers were not perfectly consistent. Damp boots left near the wall raised humidity and dropped efficiency. Every time someone opened the airlock during cooking, heat escaped. Wind direction mattered. A northwest blow pushed harder against the thick walls but also packed insulating snow against them, while a southeast blow found the thinner walls and the repaired cladding gaps. The stove's output varied with the wood's dryness and the draft's behavior, but the pattern held. The ice house used less wood because the fire was maintaining heat, not replacing it. In a cabin with single plank walls and cracks, the stove fought a war of attrition against every gap, every breath of wind, every square foot of uninsulated surface. In the partition room, the stove lit a match and the walls kept it burning. The difference was not dramatic on any single day. Over a winter, it was the difference between a family that ran out of wood and a family that did not. Malin shared freely. He did not charge for advice. He did not hoard the design. He told poor families the parts that mattered most: keep the fill dry, sawdust, shavings, straw, cattail fluff, anything that trapped still air. Stop the moving air, seal every crack, build an airlock if possible, hang a blanket across the entry if not. Heat the smallest space you can live in, partition a corner, raise your beds, sleep close. Vent the smoke deliberately. Thimble collars, wire joints, clay packs. And measure. Write down the temperatures, write down the wood. Know what is working and what is failing before the next storm tells you. He taught because Elspeth would have taught. She had been the one who believed that what you knew only mattered if someone else could use it. Roscoe Lathrop watched the ledger go up on Tilden's wall and understood what it meant. It meant the story was getting away from him. A man who loses a foreclosed cabin is a debtor, a statistic, a line in the bank's books. A man who survives a blizzard in a building the town called a freezer, while the bank manager freezes in the cabin the bank stole. Lasfer, that man is something else. That man is a judgment. Lathrop's first response was legal. He sent a second letter to the sheriff, reiterating the trespass complaint and adding a claim that Malin had endangered children by housing them in a structure with unregulated fire and no inspected chimney. Deputy Ames received the letter. He read it. He set it on his desk and placed a coffee cup on top of it. He did not file it. Lathrop's second response was financial. If the ice house had value, if people were coming to see it, if families were copying its methods, then the structure was an asset. The ice company's lien might have expired or might not have. Lathrop began researching the paperwork. He visited the county clerk's office. He inquired about outstanding claims on the Kampeska Ice Company's property. Malin did not know about the second response. He knew about the first because Ames told him quietly during a visit to check on his own recovery. Ames's feet were still numb at the toes. He walked with a limp that would never fully disappear. Lathrop sent another letter. Ames said, "I did not lose it. I have it, but I will not carry removal papers to a building that saved my life. You may not have a choice." "I know," Ames said, "but I will make him come get them himself." Spring came slowly, the way spring comes to the northern plains, not as warmth, but as weakness. The cold did not retreat. It simply lost its grip 1 degree at a time over weeks that felt like months. Snow turned to slush. Ice on the lake groaned and cracked. The drain trench beneath the partition room, frozen solid since December, began to thaw, and thaw became the next enemy. The ice house that had saved them in dry cold now threatened to rot if the drainage failed. Meltwater from the snow packed against the walls seeped into the ground and rose through the plank floor. The sawdust in the lower 6 inches of the south wall went damp in a single week. Malin smelled it before he saw it, the sour vinegar edge that Odmund had taught him to fear. He and Odmund spent 3 days regrading the drain trench, digging it deeper, extending it through the frozen culvert toward the lake. Odmund worked slowly. His hand, the one cut on the rusted hinge in January, had never healed cleanly. The wound had closed over, but the skin was red and tight, and when he gripped the shovel, His face went white in a way that had nothing to do with cold. "Let me dig," Malin said. "I can dig." "Your hand is worse." "My hand is my concern." Oddman drove the shovel into the frozen mud. His knuckles were swollen. He did not stop. They raised the family bay floor another 6 inches, setting new skids beneath the bed frames and packing the space between the floor planks and the skids with dry straw. Malin added removable inspection plugs at every wall section, small squares of plank he could pop free, check the sawdust, and replace. He built a summer ventilation routine, opened the high vents at night when the air was cool and dry, closed them before the heat of day. He taught families who came asking to pack their shanty walls with dry planer shavings, only where rodents could be controlled and sparks could not reach. Oddman taught through the spring. He and Malin built together, replacing rotten sill boards, reinforcing the airlock framing, adding a second observation hatch on the east wall. They worked the way 2 carpenters work when one is older and one is faster, and both know the other's rhythms. Oddman corrected Malin constantly, not harshly, precisely. Not tighter, drier. Not faster, straighter. You are solving the problem you see. Look for the problem you do not see. One evening, while they sat in the partition room after the children had slept, Oddman told Malin about the ice yard on the Kennebec. Not the main Kennebec, the name confused people, but a lake in Minnesota where Oddman had worked as a young man, cutting ice for shipment south. He told Malin about a foreman named Gunder Flatten who had built an ice house so tight that the ice lasted until October, 3 months longer than anyone in the county had managed. The secret was not the thickness of the walls. It was the floor. Gunder had sloped the floor toward a deep central drain and lined the drain with gravel so that any meltwater, from condensation, from loading, from the ice itself, ran away before it could touch the sawdust. The sawdust never got wet. The ice lasted because the water left. "Every insulation system is also a water management system," Oddman said. "You cannot have one without the other. The man who thinks only about heat will lose to the man who thinks about moisture." Malin remembered the sour smell in the south wall. He remembered the frozen culvert. He looked at Oddman. "You are teaching me to think about this building in summer," Malin said. "I am teaching you to think about this building always." Oddman's hand did not improve through the summer. By September, the redness had spread past his wrist, and the swelling made it impossible for him to close his fingers around a saw handle. He told Malin he planned to leave for a cousin's house near Mankato, where a doctor could look at the wound properly. He planned to leave in October, before the first hard freeze. He did not make it to October. On a clear morning in late September, with the air carrying the first bite of autumn and the lake reflecting a sky so blue it looked enameled, Oddman collapsed while helping Malin repair the ice house sill on the east side. He went down without warning, one moment standing, the next on his knees, the next on his face in the sawdust and wood shavings that covered the ground around the building. Malin turned him over. Oddman's face was gray, his breathing was shallow and fast. His swollen hand was hot to the touch, the skin stretched so tight it was shiny. The infection had gone past the hand, past the wrist, into the blood. There was a word for what killed men when rust and dirt entered a wound and the wound closed over poison instead of expelling it. The word did not matter. What mattered was that Oddman was dying on the ground outside the building he had helped save. They carried him inside. Cora boiled water. Bram rode the mule. The animal's foot had healed unevenly, but it could carry a boy at a walk toward town to find a doctor. Martha Tilden came within the hour. She looked at the hand and said nothing, which was worse than anything she could have said. Oddman died on the second evening. He was conscious until near the end. His last correction to Malin was about the sill repair they had been working on when he collapsed. The board Malin had cut was the right length, but the wrong idea. "Not tighter," Oddman said. "Drier." He died with pine shavings on his coat and his carpenter's pencil behind his ear. Malin closed his eyes and sat beside him until the partition room went dark and the stove needed feeding. The next morning, Malin found 3 inspection plugs already cut, sanded, and labeled in Oddman's handwriting. They were stacked on a shelf near the observation hatch, each one marked with the wall section it belonged to, NW3, W7, S2. Odmund had cut them days ago. He had known he was leaving, one way or another, and he had left knowledge embedded in the building. Malin set the plugs into their walls. Each one fit perfectly, each one open to dry sawdust. He put Odmund's carpenter's pencil in his tool chest and did not take it out again. The winter of 1887 to 1888 arrived with less warning and more fury than the one before. Malin faced it without Odmund. The ice house was stronger now. The sills were repaired. The drainage was regraded. The inspection plugs were in place. The airlock had been rebuilt with heavier boards and tighter hinges. The partition room held steady through the early cold November, December warm, and families who had copied even part of the method reported better results than the year before. Dagny Haugen's shanty, with its packed shavings and banked snow and protected sill, used a third less wood than it had the previous winter. Petter Stensland's barn airlock saved 2 horses from pneumonia during a December blow. But Malin could not prepare for what happened on January 12, 1888. The day started warm. That was the cruelty of it. The morning temperature climbed above 0, then above 20, then toward 30. Children went to school without heavy coats. Farmers worked outside in shirt sleeves. The air felt like March. People smiled at each other and said, maybe winter was breaking early. It was not breaking. It was pulling back its arm. The storm struck in the early afternoon without transition. One moment the sky was hazy and mild. The next, a wall of black cloud rolled over the northwest horizon, moving faster than a horse could run. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in minutes. Wind hit with enough force to knock cattle off their feet. Snow came not as flakes, but as a horizontal sheet of ice crystals, so fine they cut exposed skin. The schoolhouse blizzard. It would kill between 200 and 300 people across the Great Plains before it was finished. Many of them would be children caught between school and home. Malin was in the ice house when the sky changed. He saw it through the observation hatch. The light in the outer chamber shifted from pale gray to dark in the span of a breath. He stepped outside. The northwest sky was black from the ground to the top of the atmosphere, and the black was moving toward him at a speed that made his stomach drop. He sealed the outer door and checked the vent and checked the stovepipe and checked the inspection plugs. Cora was already filling the water buckets. Bram was stacking wood inside the airlock. Ludi was pulling bedding onto the raised beds. Asa closed the inner door behind his father and latched it. The building was ready, but the building was not the problem. The problem was on the lake road. A group of 7 schoolchildren and their teacher, a woman named Ione Bell, had been walking from the schoolhouse toward town when the storm hit. The schoolhouse was 1.5 miles from Watertown. The ice house was 1/4 mile off the lake road between the school and the town. The children were between 8 and 13 years old. Ione Bell was 26, educated in Ohio, and had been teaching in Dakota Territory for 2 years. She was not a frontier woman by birth. She was a frontier woman by stubbornness. When the wall of black cloud rolled over them, Ione did not try to reach town. She could not see town. She could not see the road. She could not see the child standing next to her. She gathered the children by voice, linked them hand to hand, and turned toward the only landmark she could find by feel, the fence line along the lake road. She followed it toward the ice house because she had heard Cora Rusk describe the building in the schoolroom, matter-of-factly, the way a child describes the only home she knows. They reached the outer door by luck, by fence wire, and by Ione Bell's refusal to let go of the smallest child's hand. Ione hammered on the door with both fists. The sound was almost lost in the wind. Bram heard it. He opened the outer door, and 7 children and 1 woman fell into the airlock in a tangle of ice-crusted coats and frozen hair and sobbing. Malin nearly made the mistake. 7 children, Asa's age, Ludi's age, Bram's age. He reached for the inner door to bring them all through at once. Both doors open, the whole airlock flooded with wind and snow, the partition room exposed to the full force of the storm. He heard Odmund's voice. Not remembered. Heard. As clear as if the old man were standing behind him with pine shavings on his coat. No opening both doors at once. Malin stopped. He closed the outer door first. He waited. The airlock settled. Cora threw quilts over the children where they lay. Bram stamped snow flat. Malin counted heads. 7 children, 1 teacher, all breathing, none unconscious. 3 were crying. 2 were silent in the way that frightened Malin more than tears. He opened the inner door. They moved the children inside in groups of 3, Cora pulling, Malin lifting, Ione Bell pushing from behind. Each group came through with a blast of cold air that dropped the partition room temperature. After the last child was inside, Malin closed the inner door and the room began to recover. If this story has shown you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival is built long before the storm arrives. Cora ran triage the way she ran the ledger, systematically, without panic. She checked hands, feet, ears, and faces for frostbite. She heated stones and wrapped them. She gave warm water to every child who could hold a cup. Bram kept the vent clear, crawling into the outer chamber every 2 hours the way Oddmund had taught them, checking the pipe, breaking the ice crust, and coming back shaking. Ione Bell sat against the partition wall with the smallest child in her lap. Her hands were raw, her lips were cracked. She looked at the room, the stove, the raised beds, the ledger on the barrel, the inspection plugs in the walls, the observation hatch with its square of frost-rimmed glass, and she asked a single question. Who built this? My father knew the principle, Malin said. A carpenter named Oddmund Brecka knew the building. I put them together. Where is the carpenter? He died in September. Ione looked at the walls. She looked at the 7 children warming in a room that should not exist in a building the town had called a freezer. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The building was speaking for every person who had built it, repaired it, doubted it, and been sheltered by it. By morning, the storm had passed. All 7 children were returned to their families. None had lost fingers or toes. The smallest child, a girl of 8, had mild frostbite on her left ear. She would recover fully. Ione Bell walked to town with her hands wrapped in strips of Cora's petticoat because her gloves had been given to a student who had come to school without any. Lathrop heard about the rescue before noon. He heard about it from a bank depositor whose granddaughter was one of the 7 children. The depositor did not mention the ice house by name. He mentioned it by function. Rusk's place, he called it. Not the ice house, not the freezer. Rusk's place. The name had changed, and the change had happened in a blizzard Lathrop could not control, and a building Lathrop had tried to close. Lathrop pulled the old lien papers from his desk and spread them across the surface. He stared at them for a long time. The papers were his weapons, the same instruments of debt and claim and legal leverage that had taken Malin's cabin. He needed them to work one more time, but the ground beneath the papers had shifted, and Lathrop could feel it, even if he could not yet name what he had lost. By the end of January 1888, the ice house had sheltered 23 people across 2 winters. Malin did not keep that number. Cora did. She kept it in the back of her ledger, after the temperature columns and the wood tallies, in a section she labeled simply persons. Each entry had a name, a date, and a duration. Norrie Tilden, January 9th through 11th, 1887. Deputy Parnell Ames, January 9th through 14th, 1887. Ione Bell, January 12th, 1888. 7 school children, January 12th, 1888. The names filled a page and started a second. The building had become something no one had intended it to be. Not Malon, who had broken into it to keep his children alive. Not Oddmund, who had repaired it to keep ice from melting. Not the Campesca Ice Company, which had built it to make money and failed. The ice house had become the thing the town did not have and did not know it needed, a structure that could hold heat in a territory where heat was the most expensive thing a family owned. Malin understood this in a way that changed how he moved through the day. He was no longer surviving, he was providing. The difference was not comfort. The difference was direction. A man who survives faces inward. How do I keep my children alive until morning? A man who provides faces outward. Who else needs what I have learned? The teaching happened without ceremony. Families came to the ice house the way they came to the blacksmith or the store, with a specific problem and an expectation that someone inside knew the answer. A man from a sod house west of town asked how to pack the gap between his inner and outer walls with cattail fluff without it collapsing. Malin showed him how to sew the fluff between 2 layers of burlap and hang the panels like curtains inside the wall cavity, so the fluff stayed lofted and still. A woman whose cabin had a stone chimney that cracked in the cold asked how to seal the cracks without mortar that would freeze and pop. Malin showed her the tallow and sawdust paste, the same compound Oddmund had used to seal cladding gaps, and explained that the tallow stayed flexible below freezing while mortar turned brittle. He taught the way Oddmund had taught him, through action, through the hands, never through lecture. He put tools in people's hands and let the material teach them what words could not. When a man asked why dry sawdust worked, Malin did not explain thermal conductivity in language no one on the prairie would have used. He put the man's hand on 2 boards, one bare, one backed with sawdust, and made him feel the difference. The bare board stole warmth. The sawdust board did not. That was the lesson. The hand understood what the mind would argue with. Cora taught alongside him. She was 15 now, tall for her age, with her mother's measuring eyes and her father's patience with difficult people. She taught a girl from a neighboring claim how to keep a temperature and fuel ledger, what to measure, when to measure it, how to read the numbers for patterns. She explained that a single warm night meant nothing, but a week of records showed whether the walls were working or failing. She told the girl to smell the walls. Sweet meant dry. Sour meant trouble. Bram learned carpentry from the bones Oddmund had left behind. He studied the joints in the airlock, the way the thimble collar was packed, the angle of the inspection plugs. He was 12 and already better with a draw knife than most grown men in the county. He demonstrated the feather draft test to visitors, holding a down feather near the stove door to show airflow direction, then holding a lit match near the vent to confirm the system was drawing. The test took 10 seconds and told a family everything they needed to know about whether their fire was breathing right. Ludi, 8 now, taught younger children how to stuff cracks without blocking vents. The difference mattered. A crack in a wall was a heat leak and should be sealed. A vent was a lifeline and should be clear. Ludi showed children how to find vents by feel. Hold your hand near every opening and wait. If the air moves steadily in one direction, it is a vent. If it swirls or gusts, it is a crack. Seal the cracks. Leave the vents. Asa, 5, the boy who had nearly died coughing during the first blizzard, became the one who reminded every visitor to close the second door. He stood near the airlock with the gravity of a child who had learned one rule so thoroughly that it had become part of his body. When someone left the inner door open while passing through the airlock, Asa said, "Both doors." That was all. Both doors. The adults smiled. Then they closed the door. Roscoe Lathrop came to the ice house in March of 1888 during a thaw that turned the snow around the building into brown slush and the lake road into a river of mud. He came alone. He did not bring Deputy Amy's. He did not bring paperwork. He brought a leather case with the Campesca Ice Company's lien documents inside it. Malin saw him through the observation hatch and went outside to meet him. He did not invite Lathrop in. They stood near the sealed loading door, the mud sucking at their boots, the building rising behind Malin like a verdict. "I will not waste your time or mine," Lathrop said. He opened the case and held up the lien papers. The ice company owed the bank $1,100 at the time of its failure. These liens attached to the company's physical assets, including this building. I'm prepared to offer you a lease, $10 a month. You may continue to occupy the structure and use it as you see fit. The bank retains ownership. Malin looked at the papers. He looked at Lathrop. Lathrop's face was thinner than it had been in December of 1886. The winter in the seized Rusk farmhouse, the cabin with the single-plank walls and the good stove that could not outrun the drafts, had aged him. His cheeks were hollowed. His eyes had the flat, defensive look of a man who has been humiliated by the physical world and cannot accept that the humiliation was his own doing. "You want to charge me rent," Malin said, for a building you tried to have me removed from. I want to formalize the arrangement. You are occupying bank property. A lease protects both of us. A lease protects you. If I am your tenant, you control the building. If you control the building, you decide who enters it and on what terms. Lathrop did not deny it. His silence confirmed what Mahlon already knew. The ice house had become valuable because people came to it. If Lathrop controlled access, he controlled the value. He could charge families for shelter during storms. He could charge for the method, the design, the principles, the inspection routine. He could turn Mahlon's freely given knowledge into revenue and Mahlon into a tenant who could be evicted a second time if he refused to cooperate. I have sheltered 23 people in this building, Mahlon said. I have taught more than a dozen families how to insulate their own homes. Cora has a ledger that shows every temperature, every cord of wood, every person who slept here. What do you have? Lathrop held up the lean papers. Show me the number, Mahlon said. Lathrop stared at him. The lien. Show me the date it was filed and the date it expires. Lathrop opened the case and turned to the filing page. The lien had been recorded in October of 1884. Martha Tilden stepped around the corner of the building. She had been inside and had come out through the airlock when she heard Lathrop's voice. She was carrying a sheet of paper, not from Cora's ledger, but from the county clerk's office. She had requested it 2 weeks earlier, after Amy's had mentioned that Lathrop was researching the ice company's property records. The lien was filed in 1884, Martha said. Dakota Territory commercial liens expire after 3 years if no action is taken to enforce or renew them. No renewal was filed. The lien expired in October of 1887. Lathrop looked at the paper. His jaw worked. No sound came out. The township can claim the derelict structure for public use under the Territorial Abandonment Statute, Martha continued. I have already spoken to Calkins. He will bring it before the road board next month. Lathrop looked at Mahlon. He looked at Martha. He looked at the building, the sealed door, the vent pipe drawing clean, the observation hatch reflecting the pale March light. The building he had tried to close, tried to claim, tried to lease. The building that had beaten him the same way he had beaten Mahlon, with paperwork. The lien papers hung in his hand like something dead. You could have told me this in December, Lathrop said to Martha. In December, you were trying to evict a man and 4 children into a blizzard, Martha said. I did not feel like helping you. Lathrop put the papers back in the case. He closed it. He looked at Mahlon one more time, not with anger, not with concession, but with the bewildered resentment of a man who has played every card he owns and discovered that the game was not the one he thought he was playing. He walked back toward town. The mud pulled at his boots with every step. Mahlon watched him go and felt nothing that resembled triumph. Lathrop was not defeated. Lathrop was irrelevant. The building had outlasted him the way a wall outlasts a wind, not by fighting it, but by standing still while it exhausted itself. Ione Bell returned to the ice house in April, not as a rescued teacher, but as a collaborator. She came with a notebook, a bottle of ink, and a question that no one had yet asked Mahlon. How do you teach someone who cannot come here? Mahlon did not understand. The families in this county can walk to your building, Ione said. They can touch the walls. They can feel the difference. But the families in the next county cannot. The families in Nebraska cannot. The families who will homestead here in 5 years cannot. How do you put what you know into something that travels? She was 26. She had brown hair she kept pinned back with a severity that matched her voice. Precise, unhurried, and uninterested in being charmed. She had been educated at a normal school in Ohio, which meant she knew how to organize information for people who had never encountered it before. She had been teaching 8-year-olds to read for 2 years, which meant she knew that understanding does not begin with complexity. It begins with a single clear sentence that the reader cannot misunderstand. She sat with Cora's ledgers for 3 days. She read every entry. She asked Cora to explain the columns, the measurements, the patterns. She asked Mahlon to explain the principles, not in the language of a man talking to another builder, but in the language of a woman who had never held a draw knife and never would. Then she wrote. She produced 4 instruction sheets, each one a single page, each one containing the simplest possible version of one principle. The first was titled, "Keep It Dry." It explained in 3 short paragraphs that insulation works only when it is dry, that dry sawdust smells sharp and wet, sawdust smells sour, and that every wall should be checked by smell once a week from November through March. The second was Stop the Wind. It explained the airlock principle with a drawing: 2 doors, right angles, no straight path. The third was Heat the Smallest Room. It explained the partition concept: seal off the warmest corner, raise the beds, reduce the volume the stove must heat. The fourth was Vent the Smoke. It explained the thimble, the wire joints, the feather test, and the match test. Martha Tilden printed 20 copies of each sheet on the store's small press. They were folded into store account books, pinned inside claim shanties, tucked into Bibles, and carried by a circuit preacher named Reverend Tolliff Asen, who had seen too many families burn their furniture for heat and welcomed anything that might keep a child alive through January. Mullen watched Ione work and recognized something he had not felt since Elspeth died. Not attraction, or not only attraction. Recognition. The sense of looking at another person and seeing someone whose mind moved toward problems the same way his did. Not around them, not over them, but through them, one clear step at a time. Their courtship happened through work. They sat at the barrel table and copied diagrams, Mullen drawing the wall cross-sections, Ione labeling them in handwriting clean enough for a schoolroom. They visited claim shanties together, assessing walls, checking drafts, recommending improvements. They argued. Ione thought Mullen underestimated how little most homesteaders understood about construction. Mullen thought Ione overestimated how much a written page could teach without a hand on the wall. They were both right, and the argument made the instruction sheets better. One evening in June, after a visit to a family whose soddy had been retrofitted with packed shavings and a canvas airlock, Ione and Mullen sat outside the ice house and watched the sun go down over Lake Kempesca. The light was amber. The water was still. The ice house cast a long shadow across the ground where Oddmund had collapsed 9 months earlier. "He would have liked you," Mullen said. "The carpenter?" "He liked people who measured before they cut." Ione looked at the building. Did he know what this would become? He knew what the building was. He did not care what it became. That was my job. They married in 1890, after the Dakotas had become states, and the territory had become something slightly less wild and no less cold. The wedding was small. Calkins attended. Martha Tilden attended. Ames attended, walking with the limp he would carry for the rest of his life. Cora, 16, stood beside her father and held Ace's hand during the vows. Bram stood at the back of the room with sawdust on his sleeves because he had been working on the ice house that morning and had not changed. The marriage was not a reward. It was a continuation. 2 people who had found each other through crisis and built a partnership through work and decided without sentiment that the work was worth continuing together. The years compress the way years do when the crisis has passed and the work becomes rhythm. The ice house became winter refuge, food storage, and demonstration building. Farmers brought dry shavings and sawdust before the first snow the way they brought hay for their animals, as preparation, not desperation. Families who had copied the method reported back. Some had succeeded, some had failed, usually because the insulation got wet, or the vent clogged, or the stove was placed too close to a packed wall. Each failure taught something. Each lesson was folded into the instruction sheets, which Ione revised every autumn. Cora became the keeper of the winter ledger. By 1892, her records spanned 6 winters and showed a clear pattern. Families who followed the 4 principles: dry fill, stopped wind, small heated volume, deliberate ventilation, burned between 1/3 and 1/2 less wood than families who heated conventional cabins. The savings were not uniform. Wind, wall thickness, family size, stove quality, and wood species all created variation. But the trend was unbroken across 6 years of data, and Cora's handwriting, neat, exact, and unemotional, made the numbers impossible to dismiss. Bram apprenticed with a carpenter in Watertown and specialized in retrofitting existing structures. He could walk into a claim shanty, put his hand on the walls, hold a feather near the stove, and tell the family within 10 minutes where their heat was going and what it would cost to stop the bleeding. His rate was low. His work was precise. He carried Odmund's draw knife in his tool belt and sharpened it the way Odmund had shown Malin, with a stone, slowly, testing the edge with his thumb. Ludi taught younger children the crack versus vent test. She visited schoolrooms with a candle and a down feather and made 8-year-olds crawl along the baseboards of their own homes, feeling for moving air. The children loved it because it felt like a game. The parents appreciated it because the children came home and told them which cracks needed sealing, and the children were right. Asa, the boy whose coughing had shaken the sled rope on the night of the eviction, grew into a quiet young man who stationed himself near the airlock during every storm. He checked that every person who entered closed both doors. He did not explain why. The people who knew him understood. The people who did not learned fast enough. Ione taught school through the 90s and kept the instruction sheets current. She added a 5th sheet in 1893. Measure your walls. It explained Cora's ledger method in simplified form, how to track temperature and fuel consumption, how to compare week over week, how to identify a failing wall before it failed completely. The sheet included a blank table that families could fill in. It was the most popular of the 5. The community around Lake Campesca changed in ways that were visible if you knew where to look. Fewer families slept in single-wall shanties during hard cold. Storm cellars and storage rooms were retrofitted with packed fill and protected vents. People stopped laughing at the phrase freezer walls and started asking whether their own walls breathed too much. The change was not universal. It was not fast. It was the slow, uneven spread of knowledge through a community that had learned to trust measurement over opinion. Malin never regained the original farm. The 160 acres that Lathrop had seized remained bank property and was eventually sold to a cattleman who used the cabin as a line shack. The good stove, the heavy iron one that Lathrop had listed as bank property, sat in that cabin for years, heating a building that no one lived in, warming walls that no one had insulated, fighting drafts that no one had sealed. It was the most expensive way to waste fuel in the county, and no one cared because the cattleman had money, and money forgives inefficiency. Malin lived near the lake. He lived with Ione and the children, and then with Ione and the grandchildren, in a house he built himself using every principle the ice house had taught him. Thick walls, dry fill, an airlock entry, raised floors, deliberate ventilation, and a stove placed where its heat would be held, not scattered. The house was not large. It was warm. That was enough. He grew old the way men grew old who had worked with their hands since boyhood, stiff in the mornings, strong in the arms, patient in the way that patience comes from having measured a wall and trusted the measurement and been proven right. He still corrected anyone who said sawdust made heat. His answer never changed. No. Sawdust does not make heat. It keeps what you already paid for. In the early years of the new century, a mechanical refrigerator advertisement arrived in Watertown on the back of a freight wagon. The advertisement showed a white cabinet with chrome handles and promised to keep food cold without ice, without sawdust, without drainage, and without labor. People said ice houses were finished. The modern world had arrived, and the old methods were dead. Malin saw the advertisement pinned to the wall of what had been Tilden's store. He stood in front of it for a while. He did not argue with it. He did not mourn the old ways. He smiled, a small, private smile that Ione recognized from across the street, as the expression her husband wore when someone said something that was true and irrelevant at the same time. The refrigerator used a compressor to move heat from one place to another. The ice house used sawdust to slow heat from moving at all. The principle had not changed. The names had changed. Cold, heat, insulation, leakage. The machine and the building were solving the same problem with different tools, and the machine would win because it required no labor and no understanding, and the building would endure because understanding outlasts any machine. Malin died in 1912 in the house near the lake, with Oddman's carpenter's pencil still in his tool chest and Cora's first ledger on a shelf above the stove. He was 68. His hands were calloused, and his lungs were clear, and his children were all alive. By the early 1890s, more than 40 families around Lake Kempesca and the neighboring townships had adopted some version of the Rusk principles. Cora's copied ledger pages traveled farther than Malin ever did. They were folded into store account books, pinned inside claim shanties along the James River, and carried west by Reverend Asen, who distributed them alongside scripture to families who had more faith than firewood. One sheet, Keep It Dry, was found as far south as Yankton, creased and recopied in a stranger's hand, with a note in the margin that read, Works, check weekly. Malin Rusk lived out his later years near the lake, married to Ione, with the old ice house in view from the window above his workbench. His children grew up measuring walls, weather, and wood the way other families measured acres and bushels. Cora kept the ledger until she married and moved to Sioux Falls, where she taught her own daughters to smell a wall before they trusted it. Bram built houses across the eastern Dakotas, each one tighter than the last. Malin died with the carpenter's pencil in the chest and the knowledge that the building near the lake was still standing, still dry, still holding whatever was put inside it. The wind still crosses Lake Kempesca in January the way it always has, flat, fast, and without mercy. The old ice house still stands at the edge of the frozen shore, its loading door sealed, its north wall dark with age, its sawdust cavity packed and dry after more than a century. They said Rusk moved his babies into a freezer and called it a house. Years later, during another hard blow, a child closes the second door behind him, stamps the snow from his boots, and enters a room where mittens hang drying on a wire above the stove, soup trembles in a pot on the iron lid, and the wall smells faintly of pine sawdust. The same smell Malin's father taught him to trust on the Kennebec. The same smell Oddman checked with his fingers on a winter morning. The same smell that meant the walls were working and the cold would have to wait outside. The building had been made to keep summer out. Malin Rusk taught the town that winter could be kept out too,